Hello, and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining ancient Egyptian thought. As per usual, I'd like to start with some disclaimers, but I believe this is particularly important in this case because ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian philosophy and thought is a particularly contentious subject. Historically speaking, Egypt was seen through the lens of colonialism in the West. So ever since the modern interaction of the West and Egypt, which is really marked by Napoleon's invasion as part of the early parts of the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, there's sort of been a fascination and exoticism through which Egypt is perceived by the West. And it's unfortunate that also as part of the later 19th and early 20th century conceptions of racial science, racial hierarchies, that certain racist theories were perpetuated with regards to the capability of Africans to create large societies which are complex with developed writing systems, etc. And as such, there was assumptions made with regards to the ethnicity of Egyptians, which was not particularly true in light of more recent constructs and understanding. As scholarship and racial science in itself more generally was disproven and essentially seen as a disgraced form of the academy, we saw a move towards, in the 60s and 70s particularly, an Afrocentric attempt to try and understand Egyptian culture. This sort of came to a crux with the publishment of the book Black Athena, which was talking about the potentiality of African and particularly Egyptian influence upon Greek society. And although some of the aspects of this critique are now non-controversial, aspects of it were also taken up by the black nationalist community, and there's also been areas of Afrocentric and also broader critical studies of classical culture in that sort of revisionist vein, which are now seen as both very confrontational and quite controversial in their claims. And as such, there is a lot of consternation in the academy, both with regards to issues of race and colour and influence between the different cultures in and around both Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly. I am by no means an expert on the concepts of race in ancient Egypt and how these different communities interacted and the impact and importance of skin color with regards to the different hierarchies and different communities that existed within ancient Egypt. However, I can speak with some limited authority with regards to the way that ancient Egyptians viewed color. So basically, the thing to realize is that ancient Egyptian culture in itself was not harshly delineated along the kind of racial tropes and dividing lines that we now see in modern Western and more global thought. For ancient Egyptians, commonly, they depicted themselves as in those that were indigenous or at least living in ancient Egypt at the time of these depictions as being red in colour, whereas they saw Libyans and Assyrians as white, Libyans being the occupants of the North African coast, and they saw those as living further south of the Cataphracts, so Nubians, Cushites, as black. But the thing is that these weren't harsh and hard boundaries. So, for instance, the 25th dynasty, which were Nubians who came from the south, were black and they were pharaohs. There is numerous accounts of both black and white by the standard of the average Egyptian, peoples living in Egypt as Egyptians. And so, really, Egyptian in the ancient construct and ancient sense is both a African identity in terms of being on the continent of Africa, but by no means delineated by race or ethnicity in the hard sense. Although I'm not suggesting at the same time that the Egyptians were a perfectly tolerant and benign, enlightened culture as well. They could be quite xenophobic and very conservative in their conception of other cultures and themselves. But rather than sort of harp on about this issue and try push it too far into an area where I don't really have a high level of expertise, I'm going to leave some books in the recommendations that if this topic is interesting to you or you think it potentially distracts from the broader issue that we're discussing here, that you can look into in your own time. Having now dealt with that particularly thorny issue, I want to talk about the issue of Egyptian culture. So, Egyptian culture is something that is both fluid but also continuous over an extremely long period of time. It's important to remember that Cleopatra, probably one of the most famous female queens, not really a pharaohess, I suppose, was actually closer in time to us now compared to the construction of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. You have a massive span of time where the intermediate periods, I'll talk about later, where there was a collapse in culture, sometimes spanned as long as the entire lifetime of the more modern nations of the world. So it's both important to delineate the fact that there is a significant difference over time in both the geographic location of Egypt and the lived culture and experience of those people, but also there is a continuous strain of commonality that continues, I would argue, at least until the Christianization and at least potentially onwards into modern Egyptian life and society. However, once again, those claims start to become a little bit more contentious and a bit of a longer bow to draw as we go further on and further forward. But one thing I would like to highlight, and I'll talk about this, is that Egyptian life is dominated by the river. 22% of the Nile exists in modern Egypt. However, that continuous water source all the way down to the third cataract linked a series of different human communities which over time shared a commonality of culture, which is the basis for this particular episode. And we'll talk a little bit about the history because you kind of got to understand how deep and long the history of Egypt is before we can really start talking about how the geography and the history of this particular culture heavily influenced the thought of the Egyptian people. So the first period of true Egyptian history sort of begins with the Old Kingdom. Now this is a period sometime between 2686 to 2181 BCE, and it's the real archaic classical root of Egyptian culture. It's important to realize that it didn't arise ex nihilo. It formed from a series of proto-microstates that existed all the way along the Nile, basically where you would have a small territorial area, many different families united under a local noble, also known as a nomarch, and these small areas were known as nomes. And it's interesting because this seems like the basic building block of Egyptian culture and society, because in the intermediate or indeterminate periods, you had sort of society fracture back down to this smallest level, the nomarch level. As history progressed, these nomes slowly gave way to larger and larger proto-states, and eventually ended up with two kingdoms. You had the Upper and the Lower Nile. So the Upper Kingdom, you had a pharaoh who was wearing a white-style headdress, sort of conical-style hat. Upper here referring to the Upper Nile, so actually upstream, so further to the south, so a bit of confusion there, whereas the Lower Crown, or the lower part of Egypt, is in that part which drains away into the Mediterranean, wore a red-style crown with a protrusion coming to the front. Now, these two different kingdoms were sort of living in a period of semi-dependency, but this was then all brought to an end by the reign of Nama. Nama was the first king to be depicted in artwork, as can be seen on the Nama palette, which is now seen on the episode Tyidesley here, as the first ruler to be wearing on one side of the palette the crown of the Upper Nile, and the other side of the palette the crown of the Lower Nile. And the symbol of the double crown would become important for pharaohs into the future as someone who was a unifying figure who controlled both the upper and lower portions of Egypt. And in some ways that's the sense that Nama is really the founder of what we can call, I suppose, true Egyptian culture, in the sense of the unification of this disparate grouping of nomes and kingdoms along the entirety of the river. The Old Kingdom of Egypt is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, or the Age of the Pyramid Builders, as it encompasses the reigns of the great pyramid builders of the 4th dynasty, such as King Sneferu, who perfected the art of pyramid building, and the pyramids of Giza, which were constructed under the kings Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. So this is the period where we see that monumental architecture first taking place. And this is achievable through the mobilization of a huge portion of the population during periods of flooding, when the agricultural processes which we conducted in the fertile Nile mud after the water had retreated couldn't be taking place. So this is really the first real examples of state power, and it's the importance of the afterlife and the importance of these monuments to the afterlives of the pharaohs and the average Egyptians, which becomes important in later Egyptian thought. However, like many good things, they have to come to an end, and the Old Kingdom is no exception. Pepi II was the last pharaoh of this Old Kingdom period, and it's actually suggested that potentially it was his own success which led to the downfall of the Old Kingdom. He lived for an extraordinarily long time for that period, into his 90s, and as such he outlived a lot of his successors, or potential successors, and advisors, and as such the auspice of the Egyptian state had kind of built a dependency upon this single individual. It is suggested that the collapse of this central figure after such a long period of time potentially created a power vacuum, which led to the First Intermediate Period, a period in which you had different individuals vying for power, the division of Egypt back into that sort of natural north and south and into those nomarch relationships, and a collapse of that centralized bureaucracy which allowed for the construction of the pyramids. This is seen as universally a bad time in the Egyptian literature, as a period where there was chaos, a period where there was no rule of law, and very much a turning away from the traditional conservative past. And this sort of goes into that ongoing relationship between conservatism and the Egyptian ideal, which has a great deal of impact upon their conceptions of what it means to be good, righteous, and well. This period of chaos was brought to an end by Mentuhotep II, who was once again a great soldier, a great warrior, and was able to bring the entirety of the Egyptian Nile area under his control. He came from Upper Egypt, he came from the Theban areas, and he went down and he conquered the lowlands. And as such, this meant that the Middle Kingdom, which would follow in his reign, was always in this sort of dynamic tension where the rulers were always seen as interlopers who had come from the south and exerted themselves over the lower Nile area. The Middle Kingdom period, also known as a period of unification, follows the First Intermediate Period, going from about 2050 BC to around about 1710 BC. It's a period in which Osiris becomes an extremely important figure, a figure of rebirth and of the afterlife, once again highlighting the importance of death and the sort of symbolic rebirth and continuation and enduring eternal nature of the soul within Egyptian religion. This period in itself was relatively stable, but was brought to a pretty dramatic end with the first intervention by an external power into Egyptian affairs. The last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom is Sobekneferu, who was one of two women who actually hold the position of pharaoh in Egypt throughout the entirety of its ancient history. The other one being Cleopatra, who was a Macedonian Greek descendant of one of Alexander's generals who had conquered Egypt much later on in the antique and classical periods. Now, Sobekneferu, following her death, ushered in a period of chaos, not necessarily of her own fault. The chaos was brought about by the conquests and the intervention of the Hyksos into Egypt. They conquered large areas of the Lower Egypt, and they were a Semitic-speaking people who brought two major inventions and technological advancements which would fundamentally change Egyptian warfare: chariots and iron. With these two devices, they managed to conquer and hold large portions of Lower Egypt for some time until they were eventually driven out as the Egyptians adopted these technologies and turned them against them. This second intermediate period is brought to an end with the reign of Amhose, ushering in the New Kingdom, the most interventionist and international period of ancient Egyptian history. Following the second intermediate period, we have the New Kingdom. This is the height of Egyptian power, with Egyptian forces and prestige pushing it to control most of the eastern Mediterranean and also parts of Libya. In this period, we see the peak reached under Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, pushing the forces as far forward in a very expansionist and imperial model, something that was not really seen in prior Egyptian history, which was much more conservative and worried about controlling the upper and lower Nile areas. We also see in this period the very famous pharaoh Akhenaten, who is also known as the heretic pharaoh, who brings about a sort of monotheistic religion based upon the worship of the sun god Atun. This, however, quickly crumbles following his death, and his son Tutankhamun restores the traditional faith, pluralistic and polytheistic, to the Egyptian peoples. The New Kingdom's collapse occurred in around about the 11th century BCE, and the important thing to note here is this ushers in a dark age, not just for Egypt, but also for the rest of the eastern Mediterranean. And it's important to understand that the reason for this is somewhat contested. The traditional belief is that the sea peoples, potentially Doric-speaking peoples from the Greek areas, came through and the disturbance of their arrival in the rest of the eastern Mediterranean caused a broader civilizational collapse. Other arguments also include such theories as climate change or a series of massive earthquakes disrupting traditional urban and cropping patterns. However, the collapse of the New Kingdom ushered in a series of conquests and essentially a period at which Egypt no longer controlled its own destiny. With the collapse of the New Kingdom, Egypt was eventually conquered by the Libyans, people who came from the west of Egypt, and then eventually conquered by the Nubians, darker-skinned people coming from the southern areas of Egypt in and around the Sudan. Interestingly enough, the Nubians themselves were actually Egyptianized within their own culture and saw themselves as the restorer of the traditional Egyptian culture. However, Egypt fell under the sway of the Assyrians and the large Neo-Assyrian Empire, and when that empire was eventually conquered first by the Neo-Babylonians and then by the Persians, they fell as spoils of war into the broader and quite large Persian Empire. The Persians themselves fell foul of the Macedonians with Alexander the Great and his conquests, and Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, ended up in control of Egypt. Egypt retained its independence under the Ptolemaic dynasty, who styled themselves as pharaohs and used very much the traditional artwork and styles, and even married their own sisters in the way and manner of the Egyptian pharaohs before them. But eventually this would itself come to an end as well, with Cleopatra being the last of the essentially pharaohs, being the last female pharaoh as well, one of two, for the entirety of the ancient Egyptian history, when the Egyptian sphere fell under the control of the Romans. As the Roman Empire went through its period of Christianization, we saw a further distancing from Egypt's antique past and the traditions and religion of ancient Egypt. And eventually, once again, with the conquests of the Arabs, there was a slow Islamification of Egypt, which became one of the cores of Egyptian, Islamic culture. And it's much more important later on to look at Egypt once again, however, as part of that broader Abrahamic tradition and the religious and philosophical thought which developed within that situation. Having now covered in very brief detail the history of ancient Egypt, I think it's important to establish some of the key tenets which underlie the thought and the sort of philosophy of the Egyptian people. The key one to note, I think, sort of comes from the geographical surroundings that the Egyptians exist in. It's the benevolence of the world that they live in. Comparative to other areas, such as when we examined Mesopotamian thought, the Egyptian relation with the land that they lived in was quite benevolent. So the Mesopotamians were constantly dealing with unexpected floods, they lived in a mud plain, a very difficult to navigate river, and they constantly had this idea that their gods were these very standoffish, very vindictive characters. On the other hand, for the Egyptians, the Nile always flooded at regular intervals. When it did flood, it was quite regular in terms of its size. It inundated the farmlands with rich silt, which allowed for very reliable agriculture that could produce huge yields in comparison to other areas. And also, it was quite easy to navigate, at least to the first cataract. Basically, if you wanted to go downriver, you would put down your sails and the current would drag you towards the Mediterranean. And then if you want to go upriver, you had a fairly regular wind blowing from north to south, so you'd just hoist your sails and you'd be carried back down, back up, I should say, the river towards Thebes. Now, the issue here is that with a rather benevolent worldview and with a rather proud culture built around the idea of the river as the center of the world, Egyptians became very insular. They were very conservative. They saw the world as existing in a sort of a circular system of time where the flow of the rivers was endless. There was a movement from a distant mythical past into a potential future, but that future was always going to be benevolent and good, and that everything existing on the periphery of their world was essentially, once again, on the periphery of the actual world. It was away from the center, which was the Nile itself. This concept of benevolence needs to also be understood in the context of the Egyptian concept of being. And what by this mean is the real ontological understanding of Egyptian nature and of the Egyptian self. First of all, for Egyptians, there was actually multiple forms of what I suppose in a post-Judeo-Christian Platonic style sense one would consider the soul. The first of this is the ka. Now, the ka is sort of seen as the that aspect of the spirit which is generative, but also gives energy and motion, kind of the animative spirit, in the sense of the Aristotelian word. Besides the ka, you also had the ba. Now, this was more so the individual's moral self, not so much as in the individual's thoughts and processes, but that aspect of the soul which bore the weights and burdens of the individual's actions, and that aspect of continuity which linked that individual through in time. Finally, you had the Ak. Now, in the oldest times of Egyptian literature, the Ak was only seen as part of the soul for a pharaoh. This was the part of the soul which would mingle with the gods in the afterlife, and as such, it was only deemed as existing in those that were worthy. And it's this kind of tripartite soul solution which was seen as both energizing the individual, animating them, but then also creating a continuity of being throughout their life and then also into the afterlife. Eventually, this tripartite system didn't only apply to the pharaoh, but was sort of democratized. It ended up being applied to all Egyptians. Not to suggest that Egypt was ever a democracy, it's just that in the intermediate periods, forms and processes and rituals that were only really restricted to the royal house eventually were diffused, at first through the nobles and then even throughout the middle class and broader Egyptian society. Besides the soul, there was also a cognizance of other aspects of the body, being the flesh itself, mind, an individual's name, and their shadow. Now, these aren't necessarily as important in terms of understanding sort of the Egyptian conception of metaphysics. However, they're important from a magical perspective in terms of the way in which magic was employed in Egyptian society. And in one of the references that I have left as a potential reading for you, there's some rather interesting documentation and talking about how Egyptian conception of magic and employment of magic in day-to-day life worked. Now, I talked about the fact that Osiris became an extremely important god in the Middle Kingdom period. Now, this is important because Osiris represented the afterlife, the underworld and rebirth in ancient Egyptian religion. He has a rather interesting history in terms of his own mythology. Once again, I suggest the reading resources that I've left at the bottom of this video if you want to understand more about it. But it's key to understand that in the Egyptian mythos, he provided a conduit through which the living pharaoh would then go and become one with the gods in the afterlife. Now, It's important because this conception of a blessed afterlife is very different from what we see in sort of the ancient Greek and the Mesopotamian accounts in the Eastern Mediterranean. For the Greeks, if you read Homer, the existence of shades in Hades flitting around as though bats, it seems rather discouraging in terms of what it's like to live in the afterlife. Similarly, some of the accounts, if you read some of the extended versions of the story of Gilgamesh, you'll see a very sort of inhospitable domain after death where people live a very sorrowful life. And even in the early Jewish accounts, there seems to be this idea that Sheol, so that period, that place of darkness, the shade where people die and go down to, isn't really a place where there's a paradise awaiting one's death. And it's really sort of for the first time in the Egyptian account that we see this sort of idea of a paradise after one dies. Now, once again, initially this was only for the pharaohs, and we see the giant pyramids, we see these elaborate rituals to preserve the Ba, the Ka, the Ach following death. However, it sort of democratizes over time, becomes more available to other people, and a huge industry is built around what it takes to become someone who lives in the afterlife. And the thing is that it's interesting from a religious point of view and from a moral point of view in the Egyptian sense that one doesn't merely purchase one's place in the afterlife, it's actually earned. So how does one earn one's position in the afterlife with Osiris? One must go through a series of judgments. Now, there was an entire industry built around the charms, the spells, the correct ritual manners, which would preserve the body, preserve the souls, allow them to be housed in this world, and allow them to safely pass into the afterlife. However, it's important to realize that it's not just about these things. There was also strictures within the social controls that defined what it meant to be a good person in ancient Egypt, which suggested that if one did not abide by the social mores, by the morals of ancient Egypt, that one would be punished. One would, in the afterlife, suffer for what one had done during one's life. Key to understanding what is this sort of golden maxim, this rule within Egyptian religion, is understanding the goddess Maat. So Maat is a goddess with the symbol of an ostrich feather, and she represents truth, order, and goodness within the Egyptian system. And it's not only her name, but she is the personification of these things in Egyptian life. And it's all about living in order to make oneself a moral representative of Maat in this world, so that one's Ak and one's Ba can pass on to live happily following one's death in the afterlife, in the paradise. So what did this mean in real concrete terms? For the average Egyptian, Maat is defined as a principle primarily with respect to other people. The Egyptian sense of self didn't nearly have this idea of the atomistic individual that we do in the modern Western concept. Rather, it's about one's duties as a superior to one's subordinates, as a family member to one's mother, to one's father, to one's brothers and sisters, and as one who is lucky, fortunate, wealthy, and powerful to those that are poor, but also reciprocally as someone who is a servant to one who is one's master. It's about maintaining order. It's about maintaining and preserving the status quo within a society. And it's always about, when we're looking at this wisdom literature, returning back to the golden age, returning back to that sort of normative conception of what is the good. And part of this could be explained away as why Egypt is such a conservative society in the ancient sense. They are a society that looks back on classical forms, on classical art, and on the mechanisms and mannerisms of the olden days as the best and the most preferred. But it's important to see that Maat is linked to that conception of as the world as being beneficial. So Maat in itself is key as a mechanism for preserving oneself within a beneficial world, in that beneficial and glorious afterlife, the paradise. And so it's that that dual mixture of a beneficent world and an eternal soul, which then becomes enmeshed with divinity, which sort of underlies the reason why people are subscribing to this Egyptian moral system. And finally, I suppose one thing I want to talk about is that it's the reason why we also see such a subscription to the idea of preparation for an afterlife. For most Egyptians, a large portion of their life, a large portion of their effort was dedicated to preparing themselves for this final journey. By making the self eternal and not linked to the physical form, people become much more focused on the legacy that they'll leave behind. There is huge amounts of effort put into funeral inscriptions, into funeral rites, into the burial chambers, into the tombs, etc. But interestingly enough, although I've talked about the transcendence of death, in Egyptian culture there is still also a focus on the physical. So the body needs to be maintained, needs to be looked after, worshipped, and the forms and the rituals which sustain that body in the afterlife need to be continued. So unlike in later Abrahamic religions, there doesn't seem to be a complete divorce between the physical self and the immortal soul, which then goes on to live regardless of what has happened to the body. So this seems very interesting, but the question can now be asked, why is Egyptian religious and philosophical thought important for us to understand? And what I'll say is, first, it's interesting to look at a different culture from an area which is generally sort of marginalized in terms of intellectual history. However, more importantly, Egyptian religious and philosophical thought is very important in terms of understanding the matrix within which later Abrahamic, particularly Jewish thought arose, and then also the influence that these conceptions of the good, of immortality, of the beneficent nature of the world potentially had upon Greek thought. Although, once again, it is very, very important to understand the importance of the indigenous nature of those thought systems and how they arose, rather than trying to draw a direct line of ownership from Egyptian thought and philosophy over other systems. All in all, I would say that it's very much worth your time in terms of investing a little bit of reading to understand how these systems of thought arose, particularly if you're then interested in how each of these individual systems of thought, whether it be Egyptian, Mesopotamian, later Zoroastrian thought, impacted upon possibly one of the most influential thought systems in the world, being the Judeo-Christian Islamic Abrahamic faiths. That concludes today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe or also follow me at my blog at foolishmusings.com.